Hello and welcome to Security in Context. I'm Anita Fuentes, and today I have the pleasure to speak to Karim Makdisi, Director of the Public Policy and International Affairs Program and Associate Professor of International Politics at the American University of Beirut, and co-host of the Makdisi Street podcast. Hello, Karim. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So let's talk about UN Resolution 1701, which has come back into focus recently with renewed calls for its full implementation. Could you give us an overview of what the 1701 resolution is and to what extent it's been implemented or possibly violated over time? And also, if you could walk us through which factors you think have contributed to that outcome.
Yes, there's a lot of questions, but so let me just start by saying that UN Security Council Resolution 1701 came about at the end of the 2006 war, or it ended the 2006 war between Lebanon and the Israelis. And it effectively called for a cessation of hostilities. So technically, we're still, up until October in any case, it was a cessation of hostilities, not even a ceasefire, with the idea of trying to end what was 33, 34 days of war. And the most important thing about 1701 was it, in a sense, it deployed UNIFIL, which had already been existing there since 1978, since Israel's invasion of 1978. But it made it more robust, what the UN calls robust, so made its scope, much more intrusive in a sense. Expanded the numbers of UNIFIL from, I think at the time was around 2,000 or 3,000 to a maximum, to what the resolution calls a maximum of 15,000 UNIFIL troops. Its idea was to effectively came in as what we call a Chapter 6 resolution under the UN Charter. So, and this is very important, there's no enforcement mechanism as would be if it went through what they call a Chapter 7 resolution under the UN Charter. So it comes in, UNIFIL comes in a Chapter 6 resolution, so no enforcement mechanism. So what it needs to do with its its immediate tasks when it came in after the war, of course, was to support Lebanese civilians and those displaced. So they had to kind of support them come back into their villages, to their towns, and in other ways that were needed, and to in the initial parts to monitor the cessation of hostilities, kind of to make sure that that there wasn't any significant conflict taking place on the ground, militarily speaking. So the main tasks of 1701 outside of this, kind of the core mandate, let's say that people talk about the most, of course, are on the one hand UNIFIL needed to oversee the Israeli withdrawal from all of Lebanon, all of southern Lebanon. And at the same time, it would mean bringing in, so the Lebanese state expressing its sovereignty by basically through the Lebanese armed forces coming into South Lebanon for the first time in a long, long time. And as the Israelis are withdrawing from South Lebanon, the Lebanese army would come in into the villages and into the towns and basically deploy all the way up to what is called the Blue Line, which is really the line of withdrawal between the Israelis and the Lebanese. So it's not a border. There's still no border in Lebanon. So it's called the Blue Line. So the Lebanese army was to deploy up until the Blue Line for the first time in a very long time. So that's the core task. The second core task in 1701 is that UNIFIL should also support what's called, I'm reading it here, this establishment between the Blue Line and the Litani River, i.e. South Lebanon, an area free of armed personnel, military assets, and weapons other than those of the Lebanese government and UNIFIL. So basically, this idea that only those forces authorized by the Lebanese government, as well as UNIFIL, could operate in South Lebanon, have weapons, have military assets. And then the third thing, of course, is to more generally support Lebanon's sovereignty and the territorial integrity, meaning not only the withdrawal of Israeli occupation troops, which is obvious, but also, of course, to monitor and make sure that the Israelis, did not break the airspace, the sea, and the Lebanese territory, to make sure that there were no Israeli incursions into Lebanon. So, on the one hand, there's the idea of disarming anybody not authorized by the Lebanese government in South Lebanon. On the other hand, the Israelis had to withdraw fully from all of Lebanon and at the same time stop its its daily and hourly kind of incursions from mostly airspace, but also land and sea. So that's these are the kind of the core. It's a fairly long resolution as resolutions go to deploy peacekeepers, but these are the main kind of tasks around 1701.
Thank you. So different parties seem to interpret 1701 in different ways, which influences the negotiation process. So I wanted to ask you how these varying perspectives are shaping the negotiations. That is, how do groups like Hezbollah, the Lebanese government, and Israel each view 1701 in the context of these negotiations, and what's the impact of these different views?
Well, this resolution 1701, in a sense, caps a. This was in 2006, in August of 2006. And in a sense, it capped a period, a very kind of interesting but very unstable and violent period that began not really after September 11, 2001, but really after the US invasion and destruction of Iraq in 2003, within this larger context of the American led kind of what they call the war on terror. And it was fairly clear to most people that one of the intentions of that kind of post-Iraq invasion was to then sweep through countries like Lebanon and Syria and sort of Palestine along the way, remove the Syrian and Lebanese kind of Hezbollah threat, and then eventually make their way to Iran and do what they're trying to do today, as you can see, sort of to destroy these different countries or the military capabilities of these different countries, and get to what they consider at that point the most powerful enemy to Israel, not enemy, really threat to Israel, really, and that is Iran. So this is the kind of a context which is important to talk about. The another context which I think is important to talk about, just in the Lebanese dimension, is that prior to the war itself, there was this period, as I said, right after the Iraq War, where the U.S. attention kind of shifted to Lebanon. And it shifted through a series of Security Council resolutions. The French as well were part of this. And one of the kind of, let's say, infamous resolutions that came out at the time was this resolution 1559, which most Lebanese know about and still talk about. And that is what was considered at the time. It had two aspects to it. One was that what they called foreign armies should withdraw from Lebanon, and this was in 2004, I should say, the end of 2004. That all forces should withdraw from Lebanon, and what they meant by this was more that at the time the Syrian military was still inside Lebanon, so the idea was that the Syrian military had to withdraw from Lebanon. And the second part was that, again, in a sense, it could be interpreted as disarming, as making sure that there's no, what they call militias operating in Lebanon, again, outside of what the Lebanese state or the Lebanese government would authorize. Hezbollah is not named, but clearly in the West and among those in Lebanon that were opponents of Hezbollah clearly understood it to mean Hezbollah, at least mostly towards Hezbollah and some other maybe Palestinian factions in Lebanon as well. So this context is important because right after the passage of this resolution 1559, the Lebanese president at the time, Emil Lahoud, whose term was just finishing by the end of 2004, he basically, the parliament, was meeting or met and ended up meeting just after that, just after Resolution 1559, to do a constitutional amendment and extend President Lahoud's term by 3 extra years. And Lahoud at that point was considered to be closer to the Syrian and resistance and Hezbollah kind of camp, as opposed to the other side that was very anti-Syria and increasingly anti-Hezbollah in its political makeup. So this context is important because soon after that, what was then former Prime Minister Rafiq Hariri was killed in early 2005. And so there were two very big demonstrations on March 14th and March 8th of 2005. And that kind of creates this political divide, which in a sense, we still talk about this March 8th, which is the more kind of pro-resistance, pro-Hezbollah side, versus March 14, which is the anti-Syrian, anti-kind of Hezbollah alliance that formed over that year and then many years after that. And it's important because there was a lot of internal agitation and even sectarian use of sectarian, weaponizing sectarian language and discourse and fears, in a sense, to try to put pressure on Hezbollah to disarm. The Syrian army did withdraw in this period, but the disarming of Hezbollah and the weakening of it didn't work in its internal dimension. So the Israelis in 2006, with very strong American support, said, "Okay, we're going to basically take a pretext and invade Lebanon in order to implement this 1559, basically, in order to to defeat Hezbollah." In military terms, again, we see echoes today, right? To go into Lebanon to defeat Hezbollah in military terms, and ensure that only the Lebanese army, can deploy in the south, and in effect there'd be a kind of more friendly government to the West and to the Israelis that would be installed. So this is the context of what happened. So as a result of the war and as a result of Resolution 1701. There's kind of a long history to this, in a sense, throughout the war itself. And in the initial interpretations of the draft resolution of 1701, the Americans especially, but the French, in part as well, took the Israeli demands to try to create a much stronger resolution. They wanted to produce a much stronger resolution in which there would be an enforcement mechanism and would be basically enforced by some NATO type force that would be able to go into South Lebanon and kind of forcefully disarm Hezbollah and kind of pacify the south. That was on the assumption that the Israelis and Americans had early on the war that Hezbollah would be defeated fairly quickly. Now, as that war went on, after the first week, then the second week, the third week, and the fourth week, it became clear that Hezbollah was not only being defeated, it was gaining in strength. Politically, certainly across the region, it kept firing rockets, over across the blue line. It was steadfast. It continued to fight and to resist Israeli forces. It inflicted quite a few losses on the Israeli military that had invaded South Lebanon at that point, and so they performed incredibly well relative to what the Americans, the Israelis, and perhaps many others were expecting them to do. And as a result of what was happening on the ground, you ended up with a kind of this resolution 1701. So what 1701 does in this, I'm coming to the question of narratives, what it comes to is that they, in effect, it takes some of the language that was in that draft resolution, which was meant to have been stronger, kind of more NATO type force, enforcement type, and bring some of that language into the final resolution itself. But the resolution itself also was very much a Chapter 6 resolution. In other words, there could be no actual enforcement mechanism. And so instead of having some kind of NATO force, it simply extended and made more robust UNIFIL. And so embedded in this resolution, in the text of this resolution, two sides came up with two different stories. The Israelis with their American backers and the backers inside Lebanon, sort of the factions that are hostile to Hezbollah, came out and said, well, the most important thing in this resolution is it says very clearly Hezbollah has to disarm. And the Lebanese army needs to deploy to the blue line, and all kind of decisions that relate to security have to be taken by the Lebanese government, and Hezbollah should kind of fold into the government, and that's it, and have no military force. Hezbollah, for its part, says, no, that's not what the resolution says. So Hezbollah, their backers and others, say, no, that's not what 1701 says. They say 1701 says that we work with the Lebanese government, and that any weapons or force or armed personnel or assets, as long as they're approved by the Lebanese government, they're allowed to be there. So what they did, of course, was they, in a sense, the weapons were remained, but were either taken north of the Litani River, and those that remained were hidden. So the kind of compromise was to remove them from sight and kind of hide them more or less, and remove parts of its arsenal north of the Litani River itself in any case. And so the idea, as far as Hezbollah is concerned, is to say, look, we are part of the Lebanese state. We are part of the Lebanese government. The resistance was formally, and had been ever since the 1990s onwards, the Lebanese government had always accepted formally the rationale that Hezbollah was a resistance, and resistance was part of the Lebanese state. And so therefore, it wasn't illegal. So it wasn't a militia in the way that the other Lebanese militias at the end of the civil war were forced to remove all their weapons. So it's not a normal militia as such, it was a resistance that was recognized by the Lebanese government. Now, those that opposed Hezbollah said, well, that's just because the Syrians were in Lebanon and they gave them this ability to do so. As far as Hezbollah is concerned, as far as all their supporters are concerned, no, this is a natural right for the resistance to continue because the Israeli threat had never ceased for many, many decades. So this interpretation, on the one hand, 1701 saying it's only about disarming Hezbollah, and on the other hand saying, no, it's about protecting Lebanon's sovereignty. That needs to be protected by force, if need be, by a resistance that's been authorized and legitimized by the Lebanese state. And on the other hand, by allowing the UN and UNIFIL and all these other forces to insist that the Israelis no longer violate Lebanese airspace, its territorial seas and land. Right. So as long and it makes sure that the Israelis had needed to withdraw from remaining villages and areas that Lebanon claimed the Israelis were still occupying, including at that point the village of Hajar and some other what the Lebanese claim to be what the UN says are disputed areas, but Lebanon claims are Israeli occupied Lebanese lands. So there's all these reservations taking place, and so both these interpretations, in a sense, were allowed to continue for the decade, and what is it? So it's nearly 2 decades until October, 17, 18 years or so since the 2006 war until, let's say October or so of last year. And I would say that during this period, it was, most people in a sense considered to have been successful in the sense that there was a cessation of hostilities, really. There were various incidents here and there, but the UNIFIL did play an effective role in that it was given via this resolution 1701. It was given a series of dispute resolution mechanisms, including what's called this tripartite mechanism, where you have in Naqoura, which is on near the Blue Line, right? This is where the UNIFIL headquarters are in the town of Naqoura in South Lebanon. It brings together, not directly, but indirectly, the sort of representatives of the Lebanese army, representatives of the Israeli army through UNIFIL, and indirectly. So, of course, there's no direct relations, but indirectly, if there was an issue, it would be communicated in this way to each other to make sure that certain concerns or problems, etc., were addressed in this kind of way. There's also other kinds of less formalized dispute and what they call de-escalation mechanisms that were in place, and they generally worked. So there would be also, UNIFIL would coordinate. So if the Lebanese army wanted to do something, the UNIFIL would coordinate with the Israeli side, saying, "Okay, look, they're doing this, so just be aware they're going to do this, so that you don't think that it's some kind of military move, and vice versa." So there was this kind of coordination. There was dispute resolution. There was de-escalation, and at the same time, there were also, in line with Resolution 1701, meeting with various delegations to try over time to take what was this blue line and eventually, sort of in the ideal thing as far as they're concerned, eventually to agree on every part of the blue line along this line until both sides would agree, and then that would become de facto eventually, when there would be a treaty, that would become the border between Lebanon and Israel. Now, of course, that never happened because Lebanon doesn't recognize Israel, and there never was a treaty, at least until now. So UNIFIL has played this kind of role, let's say, in mediating this cessation of hostilities and what must be called a relative calm. And South Lebanon was until last year was considered one of the most stable areas in Lebanon during that period, where even in Beirut things were gotten quite difficult in 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010 in that area. So there was tensions, and in the north as well. So South Lebanon was relatively calm, relatively stable, and so 1701 and UNIFIL were able to achieve that. So that's one has to sort of put that on the record. There was a lot of problems. We don't have time for this, but there was sort of overall there was a kind of positive development, and everybody kind of criticizes UNIFIL, but there's a kind of recognition that they did their role. At the same time, and I think this is where you're coming to here, it was also fairly clear, and UNIFIL is very clear about this, and it's kind of stated in the resolution itself, This cessation of hostilities and the deployment of UNIFIL and this Resolution 1701, with all its mechanisms, is meant only to exist for a short period of time as a political solution was going to be had and done and agreed to over the years at the Security Council or other areas regionally, etc., to try to produce something much bigger than a cessation of hostilities, some kind of agreement that would satisfy all sides, if that was even possible. But that's the idea. In other words, peacekeeping, cessation of hostilities, all this stuff doesn't. It is not meant to be a permanent state of affairs. Although, as an aside, UNIFIL formerly is called the UN Interim Force for Lebanon because it was deployed in 1978 when Israel invaded then, on the basis that it was meant to be there just for a small, short interim period. And then they would, and until the Israelis would withdraw from Lebanon. But they ended up staying until now. So, interim in Lebanon and in Palestine seems to take a very, very long time when it comes to the Israelis complying and withdrawing from occupied lands. So,
wait, so
yeah, please.
how do you, in the current situation, how do you see things moving forward? Like, what kind of impact do you think the UN should have in successfully implementing 1701? And how do you see the current role and the future of UNIFIL in Lebanon, in southern Lebanon?
Yeah, well, that's the question people are trying to sort out now. I mean, I would say that in parallel to the 2006 war, I mentioned that sort of the intention, in a sense, of what the Americans wanted to produce in the Security Council, on the assumption that the Israelis were going to win and win quite big, and that Hezbollah would be defeated. So they wanted a kind of enforcement mechanism, and what they ended up with was this 1701, which Hezbollah accepted at the time, which says a lot of things. As I said, has multiple narratives or enables multiple narratives, but doesn't have much teeth or enforcement mechanisms. Now I'd say the same thing. What would end up happening is going to depend, particularly what takes place, not so much in terms of the Israeli assassinations and all this kind of stuff, but really what goes on in the battles in South Lebanon. So Israelis are trying to invade, or they have invaded, but it's been, there's been very fierce resistance in southern Lebanon by, mainly by Hezbollah, and the Israelis have not been able to go into South Lebanon beyond a very, a kilometer, couple of kilometers here and there, and then they come through, and then they're chased out, and then they come back, and so slowly they're trying to push in, but they're meeting with very, very fierce resistance. Now, the outcome of these battles, I think, will help determine what the, assuming we're going to get to some kind of solution eventually, and that's a big if, frankly. But if you go with the scenarios that are being discussed, there's in particular by the U.S. envoy, who's called Amos Hochstein, who's an Israeli-American mediator between the Israelis and the Lebanese side, and he came in at the beginning of this let's say the step up of Israeli aggression that began a couple of months ago. And when they saw that the Israelis, the assassinations, the pager bombings, the kind of attacks in Lebanon were ramping up and what they considered to be successful, they started to impose much stronger conditions on Lebanon if there were to be a ceasefire or another cessation of hostilities in Lebanon. So the idea was, again, we can talk about this a lot, but there was a kind of surrender treaty. They were kind of being asked to sign a surrender treaty in which South Lebanon would be given up, not formally, but de facto, in a sense. Then, as Hezbollah, in a sense, started to regroup, and it became clear that, operationally speaking, in South Lebanon, the forces there were regrouping and were able to resist and fight without much of the political and military central command in Beirut, mostly having been assassinated. They were able to increasingly kind of continue. They're able now, still dozens of rockets every single day are crossing onto the other side and hitting targets in military areas, also in cities like Haifa and Tel Aviv. So the Hezbollah capability has continued. And so it becomes clear, like in 2006, that if Hezbollah were to have been totally defeated and Israel had been invaded and kind of won, so to speak, in South Lebanon, then that idea of imposing a surrender treaty on the Lebanese government, I think, would be quite a serious option. What's happened since then is, with this in mind, that it's not been happening in South Lebanon, with Hezbollah, as I said, fighting a very fierce resistance. This guy Hochstein has now gone back, came back last week with a second proposal, which was less than that. So he came back and said, okay, the Israelis, etc., we, the Americans, will accept a return to a 1701, but with much more of an enforcement mechanism attached to it. So not a surrender treaty. So it's sort of formally still goes back to 1701, which already exists, and that's very important, but with a much stronger enforcement mechanism attached to it. So it's not just saying, okay, you need to disarm, and we'll kind of have UNIFIL with the Lebanese army trying to see are there arms in South Lebanon, but a much more stringent one that really itemizes and follows up and makes sure that they can do it, with the Israelis being given plenty of leeway to go into Lebanon when they want in order to kind of follow up. Of course, the Lebanese rejected that, Hezbollah rejected that, and the fighting continued on the ground. Now we see that Hoxin is in Tel Aviv right now, and they're trying to come up with another proposal, which is, again, 1701, but no longer with a very, very strong enforcement mechanism, more, let's say, of a coordinating mechanism. So something, again, less forceful, something that the Lebanese can increasingly say, okay, now we can begin to kind of talk about this and accept the idea, of course, that 1701 has to be done. The Lebanese have already accepted 1701, or returned to 1701. Hezbollah, in a sense, indirectly, through the parliament speaker, Nabi Hamid, has already accepted 1701 as a way to reach a cessation of hostilities again. And the Americans are saying, okay, 1701, but we put a certain coordinating mechanism just to kind of grant a bit more of a seriousness to it and a bit more follow-up, rather than it just being kept open for kind of a weak coordination mechanisms. So this is where we are today. But for one, if you asked me, I would say I don't think the Israelis, and Netanyahu in particular, are serious. I don't think the Israelis ever negotiate in good faith. We can see this with the Palestinians. We can see this with the Lebanese in general. I think they're absolutely not to be taken seriously when it comes to negotiations. We saw that, and by the way, we saw that when the Lebanese government accepted an American-French plan, and it seemed fairly clear that Hezbollah and Sayyid Hassan Nasrallah had accepted to do I think at the time it was a three-week ceasefire between the Israelis and the Lebanese, as they would then go and kind of discuss and negotiate the larger ceasefire in Gaza as well. So they're kind of a pause for 3 weeks. Lebanon and Hezbollah accepted. That's the day when there were all the UN meetings. Netanyahu went to New York, and he gave the order to assassinate Sayyid Nasrallah from there. So as soon as there was an agreement, they killed Hassan Nasrallah, and understood that would just kind of increase the conflict and the war inside Lebanon, and force the Americans to kind of go along with the Israelis. So each time there's been negotiations that have become a bit more serious, and they try to come to an agreement. The Lebanese side tends to agree. The government kind of agrees with anything that they're told, basically, as long as it nominally says, okay, there's sovereignty. Hezbollah has accepted 1701. Every time you get to this kind of agreement, the Israelis do something. They will either do some massive attack in Beirut, they'll do some kind of ground invasion, they will find a way to disrupt any kind of negotiation. So I don't see why Netanyahu would accept an agreement now that doesn't fulfill his maximalist demands, unless the Israelis get hit very strongly with another kind of big defeat in South Lebanon, or something along those lines, or the Americans tell them very, very clearly, you have to stop. Because the US, as it could over the whole last year, in one day could tell Israelis to stop. They supply them with the weapons, they supply them with diplomatic and political legal support. So in overnight, they can tell them to stop, and the Israelis would have to stop. So either a defeat militarily, or Americans, and I don't see Netanyahu under that pressure quite yet. And I don't think the fact that there's an election in a week is going to put pressure on him in that sense. At least I don't see it. I hope I'm wrong, but I don't see it.
I was going to say how you thought the U.S. election could affect this, and also what you thought the future held, because of you said it's a big if that we can reach a a solution. But I think you've already answered that. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add before we wrap up.
No, I just think that it's important to just people need to realize that the discussion of the arming or disarming of the resistance in Lebanon, as per Resolution 1701, it's not actually in 1701. It doesn't say that. It says 1701 is clear that it says that there should be only the arms and personnel and munitions of those approved by the Lebanese government and UNIFIL. So that's one thing. The second thing is it's important that these things be contextualized properly. Meaning, first of all, there's a long history of Israeli occupation, Israeli control of South Lebanon, Israeli desire to either annex or settle in or occupy, whether it's de jure or de facto, or create a demilitarized zone in South Lebanon. I think this is important to bear in mind when we're talking about Israeli intentions of what negotiations mean. I also think it's important that talking more broadly about Hezbollah and the arms that Hezbollah has, I think it's very important that that discussion has to also be brought in with a discussion about seriously arming the Lebanese army. So the Lebanese army should not just be a symbolic presence that deploys into South Lebanon as a purely symbolic, but has really no weapons, no munition, no real ability to defend Lebanon from external aggression, particularly from the Israelis. Has no real air force, has no real navy, and even its army is not well equipped. And as we speak, the Qataris are actually sending them food and fuel. So and the Americans, give them their clothes and weapons, and so it's a very and the UK trains them. So it's an army that needs a lot of work. It's popular inside Lebanon, so that's a very positive thing. On the other hand, it needs to be it's the idea of arming the Lebanese army has to be spoken about at the same time as talking about what do we do with the arms of the resistance when this eventually when you get to a ceasefire in Lebanon. They have to go hand in hand. But most importantly, there has to be a way to stop Israeli occupation or aggression and existentially threatening Lebanon, and in particular South Lebanon, every time it comes up with some excuse to do so.
Karim Makdisi, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today. We really appreciate your time and your perspectives, especially your time, since I think we've spoken for a while about this, and you've gone quite in depth into everything. So thank you so much, and I hope you'll join us again in the future.